We're going to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our program, Collecting Color, lecture on the Forbes Pigment Collection with Dr. Narayan Khandekar. My name is Michael Magnuson. I'm the Public Programs and Outreach Coordinator at the Art Gallery of Alberta. To start this program, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. I am currently in the AGA building, which is in Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, the traditional land of a diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Inuit, and the Ojibwe, Saulteaux, and Anishinaabe. We acknowledge and extend gratitude to the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations and who continue to call this place home today. We are very excited to have Dr. Narayan Khandekar speak about the world-famous Forbes Pigment Collection, which houses thousands of historical and important colors from around the globe. Before we get started, I would like to mention that we have time at the end of the lecture for a short Q&A. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, or if you're watching on Facebook Live, you can use the chat function to ask your questions. This program is made possible in part through the support of the Heart and Soul Fund by EPCOR. And I would also like to thank the Canada Council for the Arts for their contribution to our digital program as well. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce Dr. Narayan Khandekar. They are the director of the Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies and the director of the Center for Technical Studies of Modern Art at the Harvard Art Museum, and lecturer on the history of art and architecture at Harvard University. He received his PhD in organic chemistry from the University of Melbourne and a postgraduate diploma in the conservation of easel paintings from the Courtauld Institute of Art. Without further delay, here is Narayan.
Hi, thank you so much, Michael. What I will do now is just share my screen and get the presentation up and running. There we go. So I do want to thank Michael and Helen very much for the invitation and the support that they've given to allow me to share some of the work that we do at the Harvard Art Museums with you. And I just want to mention that I just bring this to your attention. And I'll be talking about the Forbes Pigment Collection. It's an important part of the work that we do. And when you come and visit the Harvard Art Museums, if you go up to the 4th floor, what you'll see is the pigment collection displayed across the courtyard. The courtyard has glass walls on it above the travertine. So on the 4th floor and above, it's glass, and you can see through into the conservation space. So this is our storage facility, and you can see the pigments arranged like that. And we're very lucky to have a renovated building by Renzo Piano. It was opened in 2014, but it didn't always look like this. And when the Fogg Art Museum opened, it was 126 years ago, and it looked like this. And it was not full of original art. It had a lot of copies, reproductions, electrotypes, all kinds of photographs. It just wasn't full of original art. And Edward Forbes, when he became the director of the museum in 1909, decided that what he wanted was to have a museum full of art that he could use to teach art to the students. He was an amateur painter. He was also part of a very storied Boston family, and his family is actually still very much in the public eye. John Kerry, who was the Secretary of State, is related to Edward Forbes. And I don't know if any of you know Pink Martini, the band, but China Forbes is also a relative. Maya Forbes, filmmaker, also a relative. So this family has, they've been in every sort of corner of American history from the Civil War onwards. And he was the director for 35 years, so from 1909 until 1944. This is a photograph of him in front of one of the original works of art that he bought for the museum, teaching a group of students in the year that he retired. When he was collecting, which was in the early part of the 20th century, he was buying at the same time as other important American collectors like the Fricks, the Gardners, Mellons, Kress, Huntingtons, the Morgans. And American collectors were known in Europe as having a lot of wealth, but very little hands-on experience with works of art. So they were seen as something of an easy mark. And Edward Forbes was a very careful buyer, and he really bought well, actually bought very well, but every so often he was caught out. And this is an example of where he was deceived. He bought the painting, what he thought was a beautiful Virgin and Child. You can see it on the left. After the overpaint had been cleaned off, you can see that the condition of the painting was not what he had bought. And in fact, the flesh areas had been very, very badly overcleaned. And it was examples like this where he thought, you know, what is there that I can do to understand forgeries, because forgeries were presented to him, things that have been heavily restored, or you know, things that were not as they were meant to be. And he settled on this idea of using pigments, and it is a testament to his interest in the way that art is made as an amateur artist, that he pursued this line of thinking, this what became known as technical art history, which is looking at the materials and techniques of artists. And he wanted to professionalize the field of museology in America. So what he did was create his own laboratory for art. And this is the building that he built for that process. It was opened in 1927, so it's almost 100 years ago. And he and Paul Sachs set up what was known as the museum course, which was a very important course for training museum professionals in the first part of the 20th century. And he trained curators, administrators, and other professional staff to work as colleagues, to be professional, to be accountable, to be transparent in their decision-making process, and also to actually openly say that museums are not perfect institutions, that they have problems and that they need to solve these problems. So it was a big change. And part of that, the professionalization, was to bring on board staff who wanted to share his vision, and also to help him explain this murky and often sort of mystical world of art restoration. So he employed the first scientist in a US museum, which was John Gettins. You can see him on the left. George Stout on the right was a young paintings conservator who wanted to bring science into the practice of conservation. And both of these people, actually, the work that they did took the field of conservation a whole step forward. And it's not often that you have people who can do that to a field, but these two individuals were able to do that. And one of the ways they did it was to start the first journal in conservation, technical studies in the field of the fine arts. It ran from 1932 to 1942. It was interrupted by the Second World War, which I think is fair enough. And then it was picked up by the International Institute of Conservation, both with both the editors, Gettins and Stout, actually in this revamped version, and that journal is still running today. And in this journal, they published things that that seem second nature to us, but needed to be spelled out and explained. So things like condition reports were there, and this is to show that they weren't just publishing, but that they really were doing what they said. I've included out of the files a condition report from 1938, which is right around the time that this article was published. So the article was published in 1935. So you can see that they actually practiced what they preached. And the history of the science labs is also interesting too. So you've got science starting to be applied to the understanding of a work of art. And the focus of the work was really about the materials and techniques of artists, understanding what artists used, what they were using to get the idea out of their head into the gallery, how those things change over time, and what they might have looked like originally. These are some of the questions that they asked and answered. And the Fogg Museums Lab was the first museum lab to actually focus on fine art. The British Museum and the Rothko were looking more at museum collections, so it wasn't considered fine art at the time, although that's a definition that's changed. And just to put this into perspective a little bit, I looked it up. The Canadian Conservation Institute started in 1957 at the National Gallery, and then in 1972 established its own independent organisation, and that was the first appearance of conservation science in Canada. So Canada was, you know, right there actually as things were evolving with the scientific examination of works of art. Now, some of the work that they did was absolutely critical in understanding how a work of art is made, and it was published in this book, Painting Materials, and it has a big section on pigments, which has often been equaled but never been bettered. It really, every time I need to understand something about the history of pigments, Gettins and Stout is the first book that I reach for. And it was first published in 1942. The edition on the right, the Dover edition, is my copy, and you can see how used it is. I use it almost every day. So it's an invaluable resource. And it includes a big section on pigments, and that's drawn from their experiences with the Forbes Pigment Collection. And I'll run through some of the pigments that we have and some of the stories and around the pigments, and also how they're used as well. So these are some of the earlier pigments. The collection is focused mostly on American and European pigments that were available. That was where the focus in collecting was at the time. And the pigments themselves are not always particularly old, although we were just recently given some pigments from Lasko, so that's very, very old, but most of them are from the 20th century and from the first half of the 20th century. So we've got lead white from 1908, vermilion, which was from 1910, Armenian gold from Venice from 1914. And Edward Forbes did contact Culliman. He'd go to England and visit Culliman as well and buy materials to add into the collection. So some of the pigments that we have here are like an entire ball of Indian yellow. And that is an extraordinary pigment. It's made from the dried urine of cows fed on mango leaves. And it was used widely in India, and we found out through our research into Persia as well. It's not used anymore. It's not available anymore. There are synthetic substitutes. And so the ball is its raw form. When it's purified, we have some examples here of on the watch glass in the center. We've got Indian red, and I just want to mention that Indian red comes from India and from the Persian Gulf. It's an iron oxide red. And I know that Crayola had a crayon called Indian red, and they stopped using it for one reason or another. And there are lots of stories about why that was. But in fact, it's a pigment based on the around the Indian subcontinent. We have pigment mummy, which is made up of ground up Egyptian mummies, predominantly the resin that is used on the binding. And you can see some tubes here that were bought and what the pigment looks like. And dragon's blood. This is the sap of a rattan palm. It's bright red when it's fresh, and then it darkens quite quickly afterwards, and it is bought in these reeds. We also bought things like ultramarine, which is made from lapis lazuli. And this is a material at the time. So when it was used by artists up until the early 20th century, it was early 19th century, sorry, it was as expensive as gold. It had to be mined in northeastern Afghanistan in the Sarisang mines. It was then carried by people down the mountain to the donkeys. Donkeys could then carry it to Kabul, and then it was transported down to the coast and then across to Europe. And so it was shipped across to Europe, and its name means from beyond the sea. So that's where it comes from. And so it was difficult to get, difficult to ship, and also it then required a lot of processing as well. So you needed to get the blue particles out of the non-colored mineral as well. And you ended up with a variety of different qualities. So you have the highest quality number 1, and then it gets lighter and lighter until you end up with what's called ultramarine ash. And you can see how light that is, but it's very good for glazing apparently. And there's an example of ultramarine on a Botticelli painting that we have in our collection. You can see the Virgin's mantle. And actually it occurred to me that the use of ultramarine, this incredibly expensive pigment, is actually replicating a blue dyed material, which probably would not have been that expensive in its original form. So it would have been indigo or woad that would have been the dye that was used for the fabric that the Virgin was wearing, but it's being replicated in the most expensive material available. We have collections of materials that belong to artists so that we get a sense of how the artist worked in their studio. So these are things that come from John Singer Sargent's studio. And I like that Edward Forbes wrote in the bottom of the box here, this belonged to John Singer Sargent, EWF. Forbes was the executor of Sargent's estate, and this was his payment. We have a lot of studio materials in the collection, and this is part of that. So we have palettes, brushes, palette knives, watercolor tubes, and so on. And as the notoriety of the collection grew, other people would give their studio material to the collection as well. So this is Louis Rubinstein, who worked as a fresco artist from the 20s until, I guess, he died in about 1980. And one of his most well-known paintings is Dive Bomber and Tank, where he was the studio artist, a studio assistant of Rothko. And this is in MoMA. And these pigments were used to paint that mural. And so, you know, we've got this connection between the stuff that was used to make a work of art, and we can work with the people at MoMA, and we can, you know, help them understand their work of art, or we can understand the collection of pigments that we have as well. So there are opportunities for collections between different museums. And we just recently, last year, we bought a group of pigments from Georgia O'Keeffe's studio, and it was a shared purchase with the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in New Mexico. And so we'll be doing some work with them as well. In 1931, Edward Forbes traveled to visit his brother. His brother was the US ambassador to Japan. And Edward Forbes gave some lectures, but then also visited Culliman in Tokyo and in Kyoto. And at that time bought a lot of pigments. And these are, you know, wonderful historical artifacts. And we have a very active collecting curator, Rachel Saunders, and she has been helping me understand these pigments, but in return, we've been able to use these pigments to help understand what's going on with the works of art that she's been acquiring as well. And I do harbour this desire to go to Japan in 2031, so 100 years later, and visit the same stores and see if I can buy more materials and add to the collection myself. But Edward Forbes would travel, he would travel himself, but he would also send relatives out to do his bidding for him. And these are some pigments that we had. They were in a box that's pigments from Persia by Mrs. Schroeder, bought from Persia by Mrs. Schroeder. We didn't know who that was. And then our director, who's an Islamic scholar, said Eric Schroeder was a very, very well-known Islamic scholar. And then when I visited the Forbes' island, which is just near Martha's Vineyard, I talked to them about this notation, and they said, oh, yes, that's Marn Forbes. She's the niece of Edward Forbes. And so, you know, it all sort of came together. And there are some other things that are where he's asked relatives who've been traveling to buy pigments and send them back, and talking to the family has helped elucidate the story behind them. And it's been a really great learning experience. Some things we don't know enough about, but you know, we can sort of piece together bits of it. We've got a group of Spanish pigments that were given by Don Luis Plandura, who was a very important collector of medieval art in Barcelona, but he was also in charge of the interior decoration of the National Palace, and it was part of the International Expo. And you probably know it more because of Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion, but the National Palace has got this amazing decoration on the inside. And, you know, it's my hope, I don't know if it'll realize, but these pigments might be related to the interior decoration of that building. The Pigments collection itself is great because it's not just wide in terms of variety of pigments, but it's also deep as well. So each colorman has their own formulation of a pigment, or their own source, or their own, you know, their own way of doing each pigment. And so we have lots of examples of pigments, but also lots of examples of the same pigment by different manufacturers. And it really is a great way to see the variety of color and fabrication behind all these pigments that are used by artists. So we have different ways of looking at the pigments, and I like dividing up their origins into animals, minerals, and vegetables. And we'll just run through some of the different pigments that we have in the collection and some of the sources that they have. And we'll start off with the animal side of things. So Kermes is a small scale insect that grows on oak trees, and it produces a red dye in its body. You can extract that red dye and produce the Kermes color, and that's the origin of the word crimson. It's the etymological origin of that word. It was very difficult to get hold of, very expensive and very rare, and that changed very significantly when the Spanish colonized Latin America. Well, they really colonized South America, Middle America, and they brought cochineal back with them, which is a small beetle that grows on a cactus, and they were able to extract from that a red dye which gives carmine, and that was the second source of wealth after gold for the Spanish Empire. And it really, you know, it tells you how important pigments are in just in terms of a country, in terms of national wealth. It played an important part in the role of Spain in the world. And this color is still used now. It's used in clothes, it's used in makeup, it's used in food dyes. So it's something that is still very important. And I've been in touch with a Oaxacan weaver and dyer, and he still uses this. He harvests it from around his village and uses the dye. So it's something that is not just historical, it's still something that's used very much now. Tyrian purple is another pigment that comes from an animal. This comes from the murex mollusk, and it is a pigment that was the only natural source of purple for a very, very long time, up until the mid-19th century when William Perkin was able to extract the purple from coal tar. But this purple was very, very resource intensive. It required something like 10,000 mollusks to produce a gram of color. And it was used on Roma's senators' robes. Cleopatra's barge was dyed with Tyrian purple. She was obsessed with this color, apparently. It was reserved for imperial garments. So it is a very important, very status present pigment. And interestingly, I've only ever found it once on a painting, and it's this Virgin and Child from 1296. It's in the Getty collection. It's by the Master of St. Cecilia. And it's used in these banners either side of the Virgin. And the banners say Mother of God in Greek. And so it's describing the role of the Virgin in Christian mythology. And for the artist to be using this incredibly expensive status conscious pigment to describe her role says so much about the role of the Virgin, and it's really spelling out with the materials the importance of this person in their religious function. Some pigments that come from plants are things like weld. It's a yellow dye that comes from this plant, and it's not particularly light stable. It fades quite quickly, but it was used a lot in Dutch paintings, for example. And Dutch artists would often paint blue foliage and then use a yellow glaze from weld to go over the blue to make it look green. And that it looked incredibly rich, really beautiful until the weld dye faded, and then you would start seeing blue vegetables, blue trees, and so on. So it explains quite a lot about what you were, understanding how the painting process explains what the pictures might have looked like and then how they've changed over time. Dragon's blood, we talked about a little bit earlier. Brazil wood is the bark of the Brazil tree, and you extract the red dye out of it and can use that. Madder is an ancient red dye. You can turn it into a pigment. So you take the red dye, you soak it onto something transparent like chalk or alum, and then you can use it as a pigment to paint with. And this madder was grown in Edward Forbes's garden in the 1920s. And I love that Forbes was so into understanding pigments that he was cultivating them himself. And here are some of the minerals that I was talking about. So we have ores that appeared. So these are both raw umbers, and you can see the different shades of color. And that tells you, you've got what is generically described as raw umber, but they're two different colors entirely. So it's nice to have these materials as comparisons. We've got examples of the raw material here. So this is malachite and azurite. They often appear together. They're chemically very, very closely related. It's just the amount of hydration in the mineral itself that causes it to either be blue or green. And you grind these up, and you need to know exactly what you're doing. If you grind it too fine, you lose the color. If it's ground too big, then it's very, very difficult to paint with. So it requires a delicate touch to get the particles the right size so that they can be used and still have the color. We've got a couple of toxic pigments here, orpiment and realgar. They're arsenic-containing pigments. Orpiment is light sensitive, so you can see this would have once been yellow all over, but then there's just little bits of it left that have resisted losing its color on exposure to light. Realgar, much more stable. And we've got synthetic pigments as well. So these are pigments that are man-made for very specific reasons. And these ones are made for painting. So lead white is made by taking buckles or a grid of lead metal. It's put into a container and suspended over vinegar, and that will turn the lead metal into a lead acetate. And then around the container, it's buried in dung. And so the dung produces carbon dioxide, and that displaces the acetate, and you end up with lead carbonate, which is this beautiful white pigment. So out of vinegar, manure, comes this beautiful white pigment that's been used for millennia, basically. And so it's just nice having a sample of this before it's been ground up into a white powder. Lead tin yellow is an interesting pigment. It's a synthetic pigment made from lead tin, and it's a byproduct of glazing or glass making. And it was a pigment that was used predominantly up until 1750, and then it disappeared and it was forgotten about. It had a lapse in its production, and it was rediscovered in 1940 at the Derner Institute. And so knowing the history of this pigment actually gives you information. So if you have a painting that contains lead tin yellow, it means that it could not have been made between 1750-ish and 1940. So that helps you understand something about the period in which the painting was made. It's also interesting for me because this pigment was rediscovered at the time that Gettins and Stout's first edition was being written, and it didn't appear in the first edition. So that's also interesting. There are many modern synthetic pigments that we've been able to add into the collection. So the collection had remained fairly stable from about 1945, from when Gettins retired, when Forbes retired, until we needed to get some modern pigments into the collection. We were doing a study of some so-called Jackson Pollock paintings, and we needed modern pigments. So we started collecting these very actively. A colleague at the Tate gave us some, and then we've been actively adding to it from different manufacturers like Sun Chemical, BASF, and so on. So these don't have the same amazing names. It's like super maroon surface treated 1090, quinacridone magenta, these different kinds of names, but they're used by artists all the time. And they're used in paints, they're used in plastics, you see them around you all the time. Now we want to understand how artists make decisions when they make a work of art, and the color, the layering of the color, how they mix colors is all part of that. And so we want to understand, what pigments we used, and you have to do a study with an unknown from a work of art and then compare it to a known standard, which is what the collection of pigments is for us. And when Gettins was doing his work, this is how he did it, under a microscope, and you would do microchemical tests, but we don't do that anymore. We use a whole lot of different instrumentation. We use Raman spectroscopy. You can see we're looking at a Rothko drawing here. It's a non-invasive, we're not doing anything to the object, just collecting a spectrum. Infrared, we've got MALDI, which is a way of identifying proteins. Polarizing light microscopy, we can look at the individual particles. Scanning electron microscopy, look at things up at great magnification. X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, we can look at the metals that are in the center of the pigments, as well as other, if we've got a metal object, we can identify the alloy as well. And so I just want to show you how we apply the technology that we have, the pigment standards and the information that gives us, combined with the instrumentation as well. So these are 3 paintings by Jackson Pollock, and they were supposed to be by Jackson Pollock. They came wrapped in a paper that said that they were by Pollock. The person who owned them had great connections with Jackson Pollock. His parents, Herbert and Mercedes Matter, were very good friends with Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner. And so he found these in his parents' storage locker, and he wanted to understand more about them. So we looked at them. And what we found actually was that there were pigments that were not available during Jackson Pollock's lifetime. So the red that was there was first synthesized in 1974, and it's pigment red 256, I think, and 254. And it was not available until 1974 as a discovery, but it wasn't available commercially until 1986 when Ciba-Geigy patented a method that could make it commercially viable. And then it was used a lot in automotive applications. So Ferraris in the 90s were this color. And then we found other pigments as well, pigment yellow 151, which wasn't available until the late 60s. So these pigments were, Jackson Pollock died in 1956, and these pigments were not available for decades after his death. So there's no chance that Jackson Pollock could have had access to them. So that was interesting. The back of this very damaged one says JP on the back of it, and it's painted over silver. And another colleague, Jamie Martin, looked at the silver paint, and he was able to say that it's a titanium-coated mica pigment, which wasn't available until 1989. And so what we have here is a lot of evidence that points to these paintings being made in the 1990s rather than much earlier on. And it really there's a lot more to this story, and there's a publication that we put together with all the information, but this helps you understand how we can use pigments to solve attribution questions. And so these paintings had materials that were problematic to an attribution to Pollock. We don't know who painted them or why they were painted, most likely 1990s. And what we had was amazing provenance. There were some people who were connoisseurs who could say, yes, these were by Pollock, other ones said no. So that division was, that consensus was divided actually. And the materials said that it was not by Pollock. There were materials that were not available to Jackson Pollock. So this is a case where the materials really helped answer some of the serious questions about these paintings. We looked at, so we're moving on to looking at some paintings by Mark Rothko. These are murals that hung in the Holyoke Centre. They were in this room here. This is a building that went up in the 1950s to house the health services at Harvard, but there were also meeting rooms. And they were hung in these rooms where there's a lot of light that would come in through the windows, hit the paintings, and the paintings subsequently faded quite badly. What we wanted to do was understand what they were made of and why they faded so that we could care for them better. And so we took a cross-section so that we could look at the layers of paint as they'd been applied to the painting. So here you've got where the canvas would have been, you've got the background color, and then the color of the figure, the orange figure. And using Raman spectroscopy, we were able to identify the pigments that were in the paint. But we found that this was pigment red 49, and this was pigment red 49. And it doesn't take anyone with a well, it was very easy to see that this red and this red were two different colors entirely, and we needed to understand what was going on. So we worked with the chemistry school to synthesize pigment red 49 and to make it with different versions. So there's this metal here can be substituted for calcium, for sodium, for barium, for strontium. And what we did was synthesize all these different versions in the chemistry school. And we could then look at the spectra. And if we just zoom in a little bit, we can see that different versions, calcium, barium, and sodium, there's a shift here in this peak. And so that helps us when we're looking at the cross-section. And we can actually go back and identify which salt is used so that we can say that in the background, we've got the calcium salt. This is the color that fades, and it fades quite quickly. This is the sodium salt, and it's much more light stable. And so if we take that information and look at the painting in a macro level, we can say that this is pigment red 49 with the calcium in it. It's ultramarine and pigment red 48 to make this plum color. And then this figure is made up of pigment red with the sodium salt. And so that tells us a lot about how Mark Rothko was painting and the decisions he was making with the pigments. But we're also able to apply this to other paintings that we have by Mark Rothko. And so we're doing experiments. We did experiments with this one. We found that it too had pigment red 49 in the background, and it was very light sensitive. And so what we can do is make informed decisions about how to display this so that it doesn't fade through being overexposed to light. So understanding the pigments helps us look after the collection better. And I just want to talk about one final project we worked on, which was a study of Aboriginal bark paintings from the northern part of Australia. And the curator and myself visited a number of art centres there. We went to Bathurst Island. We worked with Tiwi Arts. So there's Steve Anderson, who runs the art centre, Gordon Papungamiri, who is one of the senior artists. And they took us to where they collect pigments to use in the art centre. There's Gordon hacking out some white pigment from the cliff face, and Stephen Gilchrist, the curator. So we, with their permission, were able to take some samples. We went round to another location where yellow ochre is deposited. You can see here crocodile tracks. These were very fresh, and we had to wait to make sure the crocodile did not come back. It was from a 14-foot crocodile, according to Gordon. In any case, we didn't see the crocodile, but we were able to get the yellow pigment and take it back to the arts centre. And you can see here the white and the yellow after we finished unloading the truck. We visited an arts, Warren-Gary Arts in Western Australia, met with Alan and Peggy, and they talked to us about the pigments that they use. There's Alan showing us where he gets the charcoal from this box tree or batwing coral tree. Showing us here on this dry creek bed where it's a dreaming site, an Aboriginal dreaming site, where they get the white pigments that they use, and then they can mix this white with the black to make this unusual, in Aboriginal painting, a very unusual mixture of pigments to make a blue when they're depicting water. So it was great talking to them about how they paint. We visited Yirrkala and again visited where artists would collect pigments. So this is DJ2 getting some white pigment. We talked with Malkin about how she used orchid juice. So here she is applying orchid mucilage to the back of a bark so that she can paint on it. Nyapa Nyapa painting with a brush made out of hair. On the bark, grinding the pigments on a cinder block and then mixing it with PVA to act as a binding medium. So we were able to talk with the artists about how they painted. And then we took the samples back. We've done a lot of work on understanding the chemical fingerprint, and that work is almost ready for publication. And then I just want to mention some of the recent additions. So we have, sorry, let me just go back for a second. The work that we did do, some of it has been published in the exhibition catalogue. So that was an exhibition catalogue called Everywhen. And we're just wrapping up the bulk of the study to put together into a journal article for studies in conservation. So it's been a very long project, but it's really an exciting one because this is the first study of this scale of bark paintings in Australia. So something that needed to be done, and we're very glad to have been able to start this process so that these incredibly important paintings can be better understood. So some modern additions, we've got things like Vanta Black. So Vanta stands for vertically arranged nanotube arrays, and it's essentially a black of nanotubes that's grown on the surface. It's incredibly light absorbing so that you can't see any of the crinkles in the aluminium. So you can see it here, it's very, very crinkled.
go down here, you can't see any of that. So that tells you that there's no light bouncing back from the surface. Anish Kapoor is the artist who has the exclusive license for this pigment. So there's been a big kerfuffle about that. We've been in touch with Keith Edwards, who is an expert on historical pigments. He synthesizes them, and he's been kind enough to share some of his handiwork with us. We're very grateful for that. Masu Romanian discovered by accident in 2009 Yinmin blue, which is yttrium, indium, manganese blue. And he shared some of that with us. It's been in the news a lot lately because in the UK, an artist paint has been available using Yinmin blue. So it's come onto the commercial market in the UK. It's in Australia, there's Derivan Paints have been synthesizing a version of that as well. So it's been available through their Matisse color range for a while. Ed Faulkner, who is sort of the guru of modern synthetic pigments, found these in his garage when he was tidying it up and decided to send them to us. So we're very grateful for that. And Porfirio Gutierrez, he's a Zapotec weaver and dyer. I mentioned him earlier. This is some of the cochineal that he's sent us, but he uses these other materials from around his village that he uses for making these incredibly beautiful woven fabrics. And some of the other projects we've worked on, I never would have guessed that this is where pigments would take me. Working with Jonathan Olivares, who's a designer, he used the pigments to develop a twill weave fabric made by Kvadrat, and that's commercially available now. These are really beautiful fabrics. He used these pigments that are in the collection to create the 19 colors in the range. We've written a couple of books, or contributed to a couple of books about the pigment collection. This is in its third printing. This is out of press, and I'm actually working on a book now about the collection. So that will be out when it gets out. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that because the collection is away from the public, it's not readily available. People are always wanting to get closer and look at it and understand and appreciate it. So what we have is a display case on the 4th floor where we put a different display every year. So each year we rotate what's in the collection with what's in the display case, and just share that with the public so that they can get a sense of the work that we do and what we're doing and why we're doing it. And so that's what I wanted to say, and I wanted to thank you for your attention and open up for any questions. If you have questions, I'm very happy to answer them.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. Thank you, thank you. Yeah, so questions can be asked in the Q&A portion of Zoom or on the chat on Facebook. We had a question while you were speaking, so I'm going to ask it now. And they were asking how to make pigment into paint, basically, which I know there's lots of varieties, but can you explain maybe more of a simple version of that?
Yeah, so there are two things that make paint. There's the pigment, which gives the paint its color, and then you have to hold the pigment in place, and you use a binding medium, and that binding medium gives the paint its drying properties, its matte gloss properties, its flow properties, and you need to mix them together. So what you could, the simplest form is to have a slab of stone, something like porphyry. You would put the pigment down, you put the binding medium in, and then you have a muller, and then you just grind it together, and you'll end up with a paint that you can use. And the binding medium can be all sorts of things. It could be egg, so you can use egg yolk, you can use whole egg, it could be wax, it can be oil, it can be jello. That's essentially distemper, which is collagen from bones and hooves and skin and things. Mm-hmm. It can be synthetic materials as well. So it can be acrylic resin, which is a synthetic polymer. Yeah, so it can be whatever you want to, it's essentially there to just, the binding medium holds the pigment in place, and you need those two things. But then if you want to store paint for a long time, if you don't want it to dry out, you don't want it to settle out, you start adding more and more and more things. And so when you buy a tube of paint now or a pot of paint, there's a lot of other stuff in there. There's antifungal things, there's antiflocculants, there's things to stop it from settling out. There's a whole range of other things as well. So it's quite complicated chemically, and the people who make it will not share what's in there because that's all their research and their livelihood. So, it's a voyage of discovery, finding out what's in real paint.
Fair enough. I have a question. I've been noticing through your presentation, lots of the different vials are very distinct. Why is it important to keep the pigment in the original container, or is it important?
So it's interesting because the original container sometimes has a lot of information embedded in it. So the labels can have a lot of information. They're also, they're quite interesting. They're beautiful. Those things change over time. So it also gives you a sense of how things are made, presented, stored. It's part of that package that's traveled through time. So I like keeping as much information as possible about every purchase that we make. And stuff that is older, sometimes the container is the only information that we have. So it's important to keep that as well, because sometimes we don't know what it's going to say. At some point, we'll be able to decipher something about it. We've got a bunch of Russian paint tubes from the 1970s, I think. I can't read Russian. I don't know what it means. So, at some point, we'll be able to go and decipher that, and that will give us a greater context around what is there rather than just what's inside the tube. So there's more, I guess my answer is more information is better. That's the simple answer.
Yeah, definitely. Fair enough. Yeah, that's really interesting to me. Another thing that's interesting to me is you mentioned very briefly this one paint, and I believe it was called Mummy Brown or something of that nature. And I'm curious to learn a little bit more about the pigments in your collection that, I can't imagine that Mummy Brown is still produced today. So is there any pigments that are like illegal to produce now, or are, no longer welcomed by artists?
So yeah, Mummy was produced until the early 20th century. So I think Robeson still had bits of Mummy in their storeroom until the 1920s. And I think when they gave their archive to the Hamilton Carr Institute, there was still a kneecap and a bit of a spine. So that, it's a weird thing to think that people would use that, but it's bound up in some other set of beliefs other than just the color itself. Indian yellow is another color that has dropped out of production. And the understanding, I'm not sure if this is the actual truth or not, is that it was outlawed by the British government in the early 20th century as being cruel to cows. Now, whether that's the real story or not, I'm not sure, but it has dropped out of use and out of production. Tyrian purple is another pigment that is, oh my God, I'm seeing some Cindy Lack, who I know from the Courtauld from a very long time ago. Hi, Cindy. The Tyrian purple it's so labor intensive, it's so smelly. If you're making Tyrian purple, it's a really antisocial thing to be doing. And there are a few small individuals who make Tyrian purple. I know of someone in Israel and I know of someone in Tunisia, but otherwise it's not available. There's a lab in Switzerland that makes a synthetic version of it, but otherwise it's not available. And pigments come in and out of manufacture as well. So we were looking at painting by Georges Braque. There were some reds in his paint mixtures that we couldn't identify, we didn't have standards for, but they must have been there in paints that were available in the 1930s when he was painting. But they've dropped out of production. We don't know what they are. And there's another example. We were looking at a sculpture by Donald Judd, and he made this in the mid-60s. He was using a Harley-Davidson paint, and it had an orange pigment in it. And we looked and looked and looked. We couldn't find what that orange pigment was. We identified all the other pigments. And so, this must have been a pigment that was available in the 60s and has dropped out of production and not available. So things come in and out of production.
Okay, very interesting. I have a question from Linda, who is asking, what is the oldest pigment in the collection?
So I think the pigments from Lasko are the oldest, and they were just given to us recently. Jennifer Mineta gave them to us. She visited Lasko in about 1980, and the guy that had rediscovered the caves was taking her on a tour and just picked up some chunks off the ground and gave them to us. So she gave them to us. So they must be, I don't know, 17,000 years old.
Okay, fair enough. That's very old.
So we've got some other ones from Thebes that are from, I think, like the 4th or 5th century BC. So we've got some pigments like that, historical pigments, but most of them are really, sort of in the, firmly in the early first half of the 20th century.
Fair enough. Very interesting. And so Cindy asks, do you ever share small quantities of pigment from your collection with other institutions?
So there's a history of having done that. And the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has done a great job of tracking the family tree of all these pigments that have been divided up and shared. And so our collection has been shared with, you know what, I'm blanking on all the different museums. I'm sorry. I wrote a list down, but I can't remember. And then, so there's our group, and then Edward Forbes had his own private collection, and that went to NYU. So there are two sort of core groups, and then they've been subdivided. So museums all around the US and then different museums around the world have little subsets of these. Yeah.
Very interesting. I'm a bit curious about, you talked a little bit about synthetic paint, and like how does one go from like the original pigment to the synthetic? Is it just like they're just trying to match the color and that's all they're trying to do, or how does that work?
So with Ultramarine, that was a way of making the pigment more accessible. You know, instead of being as expensive as gold, if you could make a synthetic version of it, it made it much more available, and it still would carry the prestige of this very expensive pigment, but it was much cheaper and as and it still has that same attraction. So people like Yves Klein, Yves Klein, he would use, developed International Klein blue, and that's synthetic ultramarine. So he's alluding to this very expensive historic pigment as well as playing his tricks on everyone.
Yeah, definitely a trickster.
So those things change. I think with purple as well. Even though chemically it's not the same, William Perkin made purple available, and so the color of late Victoriana has got lots and lots of purple in it, and then it was available cheaply, but it still carried the status of this imperial color.
Okay, very cool. I have another question from April, and the question is, can these pigments be used to make stained glass? So I guess it's about like, are these pigments also able to go into other materials besides just paint? So
stained glass is a whole other subject.
Yeah.
Nothing about it. And I'm happy to admit that, so I can't answer that question. I think there are pigments that are related to stained glass. So I mentioned lead tin yellow. That's related to glass manufacture. Lead tin antimony yellow is another one. Smalt is another one, which is a cobalt blue glass. So there is a connection between pigments and stained glass, but it's not, and there's a tradition of Japanese painting using colored glass as well. But I just don't know enough about it. I'm so sorry, I can't go any further than that.
Okay, and then we have time for one more question, and this is by Elizabeth. Is there an artist who stands out for you as having used particularly difficult, unstable, or unusual pigments?
I mean, I don't think any artist deliberately sets out to do that. I think they, they're painting, and then we have to live with the decisions that the artist has made. I think that, there are artists like Albert Pinkham Ryder who would work on a painting for, I don't know, 20, 30 years and just keep building it and building it and building it up. And there are problems with pigments, but also the binding media and so on. So there are those ones, I was talking about Mark Rothko and his murals that have faded quite badly. He wasn't trying to make something difficult or unstable. It just happened to be an accidental issue that he came up against where the pigment is stable as a powder. So he would have had that in his studio as a powder and it doesn't fade. We couldn't fade it. And then when you make it into paint, it becomes light sensitive. So somehow the energy gets transferred through the binding medium into the pigment and then it degrades. And so, we've got things like that that are problems, but no, I can't think of anyone who's being like trying to play games with us. And I think
Fair enough.
Artists who use ballpoint pens or like commercially available things like that, those fluorescent markers, those kinds of things, we know that they're unstable. The artists know that they're unstable, but it's our job to deal with what the artists create, and then we choose how to look after them and preserve them for as long as possible.
Yeah, that's great. Well, so it was so nice to have you here talking to us. I can speak on behalf of the audience. I'm sure everyone really enjoyed it. So thank you again, and thank you to our audience for participating and also paying attention to this lovely lecture. Narayan, do you have anything else you want to say?
I am just very grateful for the opportunity to share our work, and thank you, Michael. Thank you, Helen. I'm very honored to be speaking to your audience. Thank you.
Yeah, well, we're very honored to have you. So thank you again. And so that's it for us. Bye, everyone.
Bye.